from it is ultimately what keeps you wired to the enterprise.
The money's good too, though.
The money is good too. Yeah, the money was insane. The money was crazy.
Now, if you got these kilos for $100 a key down in Nogales, then where'd you sell it? In Tucson?
No, I took it back to Boston.
All the way back to Boston. How'd you get it back to Boston? On a plane?
On a plane. In those days, it was like 1964. There was no dogs at the airport. There was no checkpoints. I mean, I look at the news now and see these people standing 3 or 4 hours and 5 hours in line to get onto an airplane. In those days, you used to walk right in, check your bag, get on the plane, and you were there. So it's unbelievable how things have changed in the United States. But I took it back to Boston, broke it up, and my friends sold ounces and made about $1,500, which in 1964 for a 19-year-old kid was a lot of money. And based on that, I ended up quitting school. Instead of going back to college, I went to Europe and then took what they call like the hippie highway through Nepal and India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, and ended up in basically in Lebanon, which is where I spent most of my time, because while I was there, I got very lucky and got hooked up with the guy who was the chief of customs, who became my big source over there.
Now, how'd you manage that? If you were like this hippie from, Boston and Arizona, and you show up in Lebanon, you don't know the language, how'd you meet the head of the customs?
Well, what happened was that I bought a sample, and I was looking to get a sailboat loaded up, and I went back to my hotel room, and lo and behold, these guys came knocking on my door at around 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and I knew as soon as I took one look at them, I thought, these guys are the cops. And indeed, they were the cops. And I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to get arrested. And they said, well, we're going to take you to meet the judge. And I said, meet the judge? Like 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I'm going to go meet the judge? But we did. We went to the judge's home, and he served me coffee and baklava. And he said, I want to introduce you to this gentleman. He introduced me to Muhammad. I won't tell you his last name at this point, but he introduced me to Muhammad. And Muhammad turned out to be, as I said, the chief of customs in Lebanon. And we started doing air freight shipments from, I would say, we started basically with about 1,500 kilos at a time, 750 kilos at a time. And those air freight things were great because it would be in the country like 2 days later. And the way you would do it was you'd find something that like machine parts or something that was being brought in from a part of the world that we would ship our hash to, and then repackage it so that it looked like it was jet airplane parts coming out of Tokyo to the United States, but really there was hash in there. And we did that for, probably 2 or 3 years before we started doing these massive commercial smuggles. The biggest one I did out of there was 7.5 tons, 15,000 pounds of hash that we brought into Newark in a load of dates.
Okay. So now you start getting the stuff back to the United States. That's even the 1,500 kilos. That's a pretty good load. How'd you distribute it?
Well, I had friends who basically were the ones who sold it. We sold a lot of hash in Canada. Okay. There's one guy in particular up there, because the Canadians have always had a big market for hashish. But, what would happen is you get a load in, show samples to these dealers, or always dealers from all the major parts of the country. And that was really what the Hippie Mafia was this connection of these loosely connected families of dealers and importers who knew each other or knew of someone who knew somebody. So someone would come to town and show a sample of Lebanese hash, and they'd say, oh, this is great. I know somebody on the West Coast who's got Thai sticks. And it was this loosely associated group of mostly young, middle-class, entrepreneurial freaks, potheads.
Yeah.
That was what the Hippie Mafia was.
Okay. I'm here. I'm about to make a confession. Okay. I grew up in New York City, Lower East Side. I was one of the yippies, 9 Bleecker Street down there, right around this time. Okay. And I believe that I've seen your product.
I'm sure you have.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. It was, yeah, right. It was, the hash came in. It was like an oval. It was wrapped in a really tight in a piece of cloth.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a stamp on it.
Canvas sacks, right. And there were stamps on it. And that was the way you told your product. In our product, we called it Flower of Lebanon, or we called it the Bekaa Valley Flower. We always put the word flower in it because the guy who sold most of it was a guy whose nickname was Flower, who lived in Toronto. He was probably the biggest hashish soft drug dealer in North America at that time. A guy named Robert Robotham, who was a dear friend of mine, still is a dear friend of mine. Did a lot of time. He did like almost 14 years in Canada for hashish and marijuana over the years. But so we called it Flower of Bekaa. We called it, the Rose of Bekaa was another name. We would stamp on the sack. And mostly what we brought from Lebanon was the Lebanese have a different way of grading it. It's Zahara, which means 0, which is like the top. There's double Zahara, which is a dealer's choice. That's the very best. Then there's 0. Then there's number 1, number 2, number 3. Now, once you get down to 2 and 3, you're dealing with more commercial loads. Most of the loads that I did were either Zahara or 1. Very rarely did we do anything lower than that. Just because, our goal was to bring in a really good product and sell it at a good price. The belief being that then you would have good karma and, the load would be sold and that you wouldn't get busted.
Right. And, less chance people can rat you out too as well if they're happy with you. You're not screwing people, right?
Exactly.
Now, it is kind of messed up now looking back as you talk about this guy who did 14 years, man. How many people from back in those days, they used to hand out some really serious prison time to people back in those days.
I wouldn't even say back in those days.
Yeah.
Because actually, when I got sentenced in 1984, and I was sentenced originally to 25 years with no parole. But had I been sentenced 2 years later, I would have been sentenced to mandatory life without parole.
Wow.
And that was because of what they call the kingpin statute, which was put into effect as a continuing criminal enterprise. If you brought in more than 10 tons in any calendar year, which anybody who was in the business at the level that I was in, 10 tons, you bring in 10 tons in one trip, and you might do 3 or 4 or half a dozen trips a year. If you're bringing in a freighter full of Colombian pot, there'd be 30,000 pounds on there. There'd be 20, 30 tons sometimes of pot. So to become a kingpin was virtually easy, and to be then taken to court and charged under the kingpin statute, you were facing when I got sentenced, it was from 10 to life with no parole, anywhere in between. After 1986, they changed the law and made it mandatory life without parole. And in fact, recently there was a couple of Canadians who were smuggling pot in from Canada across the Mohawk Indian Reservation way up in the northern part of New York State. And they just got busted and they got sentenced to mandatory life without parole. I'm now working with some lawyers who are trying to get them out and also get this law changed because it's ridiculous. Here you have a product, a plant that is virtually legal in this country now, has been seen as having medicinal value for a variety of ailments that people suffer from. It's a remarkable plant. No one's ever died from overdosing on marijuana or anything close to that. In fact, it's just the opposite. So this is a plant that has medicinal value, that has been recognized as a medicine in many states. It's legal now in California. It's legal in Colorado and in Washington State for recreational purposes. And those states are making massive amounts on taxing this plant. And then meanwhile, we're putting people in prison for life with no possibility of parole. It's all wrong. One of the things that I'm most involved in now is trying to get these federal laws changed, because the states have changed their laws, but the feds are they hate to admit that they've made a mistake and that they're going to say, well, all those people that we've been locking up all these years for this plant that we suddenly have realized is not so bad after all. They don't want to admit that they made this massive mistake and they've been locking people up for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, just a couple of years ago, Dana Beal got arrested. And I think he was at some kind of legal conference too, in a state where it was legal. And, they caught him with a couple 100 pounds or whatever. And he was in jail for a few years. Are you familiar with that story?
Yeah, no, and Dana's a friend of mine. I know Dana. I see him all the time. It's a shame, I'm telling you.
Yeah, because he's your age too.
He's out now.
Yeah.
He's on the loose. These guys, man, up there in Canada, they're in the U.S. federal prison. And when they say life with no parole, they mean you're never going home. You're going out in a box for marijuana. It's ridiculous. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is horrific.
State of affairs.
Let's go back, though, to the 70s and 80s. Now, you had this great connection going on with the Lebanese hash, bringing it in. Kept a lot of people employed. Okay, a lot of people were very happy. But now, how did you make the connection in Colombia at the same time? It's a total opposite end of the planet.
Well, when you're in that business, you have connections with people who are dealing. I mean, there was a lot of cocaine that was coming in at that time.
Right.
I was never dealing in cocaine. Never had anything to do with cocaine. I saw it as a really kind of a destructive drug that was causing more trouble and more violence. But a lot of the Colombians that were dealing in coke were also bringing in shipments of pot. So, but the other thing that I did was that I had a lot of these fishermen and guys who owned boats up and down the east coast of the United States, in Maine where I lived, and in Massachusetts where I had homes. So if somebody would come to me and say, listen, we got a freighter that's coming up from Colombia and we need someone to offload the mothership, I was able to put those kinds of things together. It'd take me a month or two, but I had the connections to be able to get the fishermen to go out and offload the mothership and bring the load in. And for that, I would either get paid $5 a pound or I would get a percentage of the load. Usually I would get a percentage of the load. And there we had a big airstrip up in Maine where we would land airplanes up there, and it either would be my load or it would be someone else using the strip, and then I would get a percentage of that. So it was all done through this, as I say, this work of people who were in the cannabis business, in the marijuana or hashish business, and who knew me or knew someone that I knew who knew someone that I knew. So
sure.
It all came about through your associations, your relationships. If you had a good reputation, if you were known as someone who was honorable and who would take a load and then pay for it within a certain amount of time and not rip it off, that's how you ended up doing business. A lot of these people who were in the so-called hippie mafia were also dealing in psychedelics. And in LSD, there was the whole Brotherhood of Eternal Love group that was out of Laguna Beach, California, who were manufacturing LSD and Orange Sunshine and Wellesley and the whole crew out there. Well, I was very close to all those people in California. Then there was another group out of Texas who were we had a place in Texas where we used to smuggle weed in from Mexico and from Colombia in through Texas. So it was this loose-knit network of dealers and smugglers that worked together and mostly knew each other or knew of somebody who knew someone else and then there was a whole group of Canadians too. There was a bunch out in the West Coast who were bringing in massive loads of Thai sticks and pot from Thailand and from Vietnam. So that's how we ended up branching out into all different areas of the cannabis industry.
Now, you mentioned how you're still good friends with Dana. We just had recently A.J. Weberman's been on the show. I'm curious, though, if you knew a friend of mine, Fred Got Better?
Doesn't ring any bells.
No? Okay.
Yorker?
Yeah, New York. Yeah, he hung out to 9 Bleecker Street and 10 Bleecker Street, Studio 10, right around that time. And now a word from our sponsors.
Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business?